My name is Andrew Eriks. I lived, once, in a city called New York. My mother is Terry Eriks. She's in the phone book. If you know the city, and you read this, find her. Don't show her this. Just tell her I love her, and that I'm trying to come home. Please. It all started when I decided around the time that I turned 25 that it was time for me to give up taking my backpack into work. It would make me look more mature, I thought, if I weren't lugging around a book bag everywhere like a high school student. Of course, this meant that I had to give up reading in the subway in the mornings and afternoons, since I couldn't quite fit my paperbacks into a pocket. A briefcase would have been out of line since I was working in a factory, and messenger bags always seemed a little, fruity to me, I guess. Too purse-like for my liking. I had an MP3 player, which helped pass the time for a while, but when it broke, it would shut down at the end of every song if I didn't skip to the next track manually. I gave that up too. So, every morning, I'd sit in the metro for half an hour that dragged on endlessly, with nothing at all to do but watch my fellow passengers. I was slightly shy, so I didn't like to be caught at it, so I'd surreptitiously watch people. Interestingly enough, I quickly discovered that I wasn't the only person in the world who was uncomfortable in public. People covered it up in various ways, but I learned to see through them. I divided them up into categories in my head. There were the fidgeters, who couldn't get comfortable, constantly moving their hands, shifting their weight, moving their legs closer to the bench, then further. They were the most noticeably nervous types. After them were the fake sleepers, who'd take their seat and practically close their eyes in the same second. Most of them weren't really sleeping, though. The real sleepers shifted more, came awake suddenly at stops or after loud noises. The fakes just zoned from the second they sat, till the moment the train pulled into their stop. Then there were the MP3 player addicts, the occasional laptop people, the people who traveled in groups and talked too loudly. The cell phone junkies were either very popular or just completely unable to shut up for more than 2 minutes at a time. Just as people watching was threatening to get unbearably boring, I found my first incongruity. A middle-aged looking man, brown-haired, average size and weight, and dressed casually. Oddly enough, he seemed almost too normal. He had no remarkable features, no mannerisms, as if he were designed to fade into a crowd. It was that genericness which led me to ironically notice him. I was intentionally trying to see how people acted on the subway, and he didn't act at all. Didn't even react either. It was like seeing someone sitting in front of the television, watching a documentary about fish. They aren't excited, aren't engaged, but they aren't looking away either. Present, but not accounted for. He was on the subway in the afternoons. It was more than a month into the people-watching experiment before he caught my eye, because I didn't catch the same subway every day, and didn't consciously sit in the same car when I did. I saw him for the first time on a Monday. I think it was a Monday anyways. And for the second time on the Tuesday of the same week. He obviously did catch the same train and sat in the same car. in the same seat even. OCD much? I thought at the time, since he'd caught my attention so much the first time, I watched him more avidly the next. He was, frankly, downright unsettling. He didn't do anything at all. He sat there, expressionless, head straight no matter what happened. A woman with a wailing child entered the car and sat right behind him. And still, he did nothing. He didn't so much as turn his head or frown in annoyance. And that kid was fucking loud too. By the time the subway reached my stop, I found myself queasy, and when I exited the car, my hands were shaking like I was having a nicotine fit. Something about that man was wrong. He was, I thought, some kind of freak. A sociopath, maybe. One of those quiet guys who it turns out has a dozen women's heads in his freezer. The first victim, his mother. I found myself intentionally dawdling after work in the afternoons, stopping to browse in the kiosks in the mall near the subway, even when I didn't intend on buying anything. For a couple of weeks, I avoided catching that subway, and when I found myself at the stop when it was pulling in, I made sure to choose a train car as far from the one I'd seen him in as possible. Then, one morning, I saw another person who set off the same warning bells in my head. A woman, just as plain looking, just as out of place in hustle and commotion around her. The moment I recognized her, I realized later, was when my obsession began. My people watching, which began as a bit of a hobby to stave off boredom, became something of a religion to me. I couldn't enter a subway or ride a bus without finding myself examining everyone, filling out a mental checklist in my head. Plain clothes of solid color, no brands, check. No expression, no casual glances out the windows or towards other passengers, check. No bags, purses, or accessories, check, check, check. We've got another. I started calling them the strangers. I didn't see them every day, even after I started taking the metro more than I needed to, even when I found myself riding buses out of my way in the evenings. But they were there, often enough. Seeing one would set my teeth on edge, make my palms sweaty and my throat feel dry. If you've ever given a speech, you might recognize the feeling. Even though they didn't pay me the slightest bit of attention, I felt like I was on display for them. I could see them, plain as day. How could they miss me? They didn't. Not in any way that I could tell. And when, eventually, my curiosity overpowered my fear, I decided to follow one. I chose the one that I'd found first, the man in the afternoon subway who always kept the same seat. I got on, and I took a seat behind him. We rode to the end of the line, and he rose and walked out before I did. Keeping distance between us, I tailed him, but he didn't go far. He took a seat on a nearby bench, as expressionless as always, and I turned a corner and waited, trying to look nonchalant. After a few minutes, the next metro arrived, and I watched him enter it, and I saw him take the same seat. I couldn't find the nerve to follow him again. He hadn't gone anywhere. He just rode the metro to the end of the line and then What? Wrote it back? What possible reason would anyone have for that? It nagged at me. Long after I rode a later train back home, tried to get some sleep. I couldn't leave it alone. Not until I could make some sense of it. I found myself more than confused. I was downright angry now. Why was this uncanny bastard, this almost inhuman person, riding subway trains back and forth, going nowhere? The mind I once read recoils from certain things, because the very sight of them is an affront. Spiders set it off in a lot of people, particularly the big ones. They just look wrong to us, alien. That was the effect the strangers were beginning to have on me. They offended my senses. I followed him again the next day, and again the day after that. Every day, for at least a week, the two of us made our silent trips together, though only I knew it. By the end of the week, I was following him for hours, until the last train that stopped near my apartment block that night. We rode from one end of the city to the other, then back again. I wasn't people watching any longer. I was person watching, stranger watching. I didn't have eyes for anyone else, though peripherally I noticed more than a few confused glances sent my way. Other than that, we two might have been the only two people on the planet, for all I cared. I lost my job the next week. My manager was kind and timid, but firm. I wasn't concentrating, I had no focus, wasn't being anywhere near productive. It was actually quite a speech, I think. I could barely hear it. All I could think about was my new work, my vigil. What would that man, no, that thing on the subway, get up to when I wasn't there to keep an eye on him? I left work for the last time at noon that day. Normally I'd have started tailing my subject at 5:30, but I was sure that he'd be waiting for me. I wish now that I paid more attention to that day. Was it sunny? It was summer after all. I could have walked around downtown, maybe checked out a few pretty girls. Could have had an iced cappuccino and a smoke at an outdoor cafe and then gone home. Put my growing obsession out of my head, found a new job, and taken to reading on trains and buses again. Instead, I waited. More than one train goes up and down the lines, so I sat in the station for at least an hour till I saw him through a window. I walked into the subway car. I noticed that for the first time, my skin wasn't clammy. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't pounding hard. I sat, for the first time, right across from him, directly in his line of sight. Watched for a change in his face. Would he recognize me? If he did, I saw no sign of it, and I was looking hard. We must have made quite a pair, sitting across from one another that afternoon, staring at and into one another It was hard not to let the building rage in me contort my face. But with effort, I was able to keep still. As still and expressionless as him. Inside, I practically screamed at him. "React to me, you fucking asshole! See me, damn it! I know you for what you are!" I didn't, though, and my silent demands weren't answered. Not the first trip around, or the second, or the third, or 10th. We rode far into the night together, and at each terminus, we got out together and waited. I sat right beside him on the bench, watching him from the corner of my eye, and still got nothing from him. But two could play that game. Finally, we made our last trip together. I had him, and I knew it. Last trip of the night before the train stopped running. I'd always let him get away from me at that point, because the end of the line is a long way from my home, and the buses stop running at the same time as the subways. But this time, I'd follow him, finally see what he was when the train stopped running. I'd get some answers. Maybe. The subway rolled on, and the anticipation grew in me. The car emptied out around us slowly, till it was just we two silent watchers below the city. I fought to keep a manic grin at bay, and the subway train slowed to a crawl, then stopped. The end of the line. The stranger didn't move, still didn't react at all. The car stood still, doors opened. I could dimly hear the last few stragglers making their way out of the station somewhere behind us. Footsteps echoing in the silence. Nothing. Speaker system dinged to let anyone half asleep know that we'd reached the terminus. Still nothing. And finally, I could hear footsteps again. A conductor or something, popping his head into each car to make sure it was empty before taking the train wherever the hell it goes for the night. I didn't take my eyes from my silent quarry. I managed to see the conductor from the corner of my eye when he finally reached our car. He looked in. His eyes roamed over us, and a puzzled look came over his face. He blinked a few times and paused. I waited for him to speak, and the moments stretched out. But then, with a slight shake of the head, he left us. There was a car ahead of ours, and I heard him stop to check that too. And then a few minutes later, the train started up again. We rode for a time, and then looped around, and the subway was parked. I could see into the windows of more trains on either side of us, and through their opposing windows into even more. And then, he smiled at me. It was just a small curl of the lip that would have gone unnoticed if I hadn't spent the last several hours studying his face. "So," he said, in a rough baritone, "here we are." I tried to respond, but couldn't right away. My throat had clamped shut. Terror filled me. I felt like the whole underground cavern we were in had just collapsed onto me, I coughed and stammered and finally managed, with a raspy voice, to ask the question that had kept me up at night, drove me halfway to madness, and led me to this place, in this moment. What are you? He ignored me. He stood, and the train doors opened. Then, shockingly, he turned to face me. Coming. He didn't wait for an answer, but walked out onto the platform. I scrambled to follow.
Wait, hold on. Talk to me. Who are you? Why do you ride the metro all fucking day?
He didn't look back or slow his step. I couldn't see his face, but it's safe to guess that he didn't react at all, no more than he had to anything else. I stalked after him, still shouting for a time, but eventually gave up. 5 words was all I was going to get out of him, I guessed. We walked along the platform until we came to a junction, then turned. Now we were perpendicular to the trains around us. The path ahead was lit from above, but I couldn't see where it ended. The trains on either side of us went on forever, as far as I could tell. Far too many trains to service one city, I realized. It wouldn't have mattered by then, I figured. But I probably should have paid more attention to that at the time. I'm not sure how long we walked. I had a watch once, but it broke. I took out my cell phone at one point, but got no reception down there. All it would show me was no signal. The stranger would stop every now and then, look at a subway car for a minute or two, but then pass on. It took me a while to figure out why, but eventually I saw that they weren't all the same. Long lines of them would be similar, and then we'd come to a different model. It would be a bit larger or smaller, or have a slightly different shape. The cockpits, or whatever you call the front part where the conductor sits, were superficially different as well. I didn't, and I don't know what exactly he was looking for. But eventually he must have found it, because we turned again. The subway doors opened when my impromptu guide stopped in front of them. We entered and took our seats. "So you finally gonna talk now?" I asked him. No answer. I sighed with frustration and seriously weighed the pros and cons of punching him right in the face for a time. When suddenly, lights in the car came on, and I heard the engine starting up. He gave me a look that was almost sad. "You're not gonna be able to go back." "What are you talking about? Go back where?" Nothing. Again. The stonewalling asshole. The train lurched into motion, pushing off in the opposite direction than the one we'd came from, I think. The endless parade of them had thrown off my sense of direction. It rolled for a few minutes, and then began to slow as we approached the stop. His vacant gaze grew sharper. For the first time, I got the sense that he was actually staring at me, rather than just looking in the direction I happened to be in. "Be still. Be silent. Don't catch their attention." The train stopped. The doors opened, and they began to flood in. I don't know what I noticed first. The weird clothes, the two long arms with hands that almost brushed the floor, the jet black eyes and angular faces, or the blue-gray hue of their skin. My eyes took in all those stimuli, but for a long second my brain refused to process it. And when it finally did, I was barely able to bite down on the shriek that tried to tear its way from my throat. I thought my heart was going to explode. Hell, I thought I was going to explode. I was like a strummed guitar string. Everything in me lurched and throbbed. My sight grew dizzy, which I was thankful for, and I vomited. My mouth was clenched shut, and I forced myself to swallow it, barely managing to. My instincts were screaming his words at me. Be still. Be silent. Don't catch their attention. That day is a blur. We rode the subway car up and down the line, still and expressionless, for hours, for days perhaps. That was some time ago. But it seemed much longer than the line I knew, the line I'd followed the stranger along. The hideous things around us seemed to pay us no undue attention, though we must have stood out fiercely. I was so petrified with fear that, when we finally returned to the endless caverns of trains, alone, I burst into tears. I collapsed on the floor and just sobbed for a long time. The stranger watching impassively. When I gained control of myself, I looked at him imploringly. Take me home, please. I can't, he told me. Don't know which one of these would lead you back, if any of them do. He stood and walked out onto the platform, and I rose wearily and followed him. He spun around sharply. I think you followed me enough. The rage I'd felt for him before rose up in me. Rushing forward, I grabbed him by the shoulders, and with a burst of insane strength I didn't even know was in me, slammed him up against the side of a metro car. What the fuck did you do to me? I slammed him again and again. Take me back! He bore it all, passively. And soon, the flare of anger in me guttered out, leaving me hollow. Please, please take me back, I begged. That's not how it works, he said. If we stay together, it's more likely that we'll be noticed. Go your own way. Be still and be quiet, and they'll think that you're one of theirs. Why did you do this to me? He gave me another, almost sad look. I had to. You will too. You get stuck sometimes. He brushed my hands off his shoulders and turned to walk away. I fell to my knees, suddenly out of strength, and watched him leave. At the junction, he turned back to face me. I'm sorry, and then he was gone. I stayed there on the cold tiles for a very long time. I curled up into a ball and wept for a while. After there weren't any tears left in me, I even managed to get some sleep. When I awoke, the subway train I'd come in on was gone, off carrying more blue-gray abominations to wherever blue-gray abominations go. I couldn't handle going back there anyways. I tried to find my way back to where I'd started, to find a subway that I recognized. But I wasn't even sure which direction I should have been going in anymore. I walked for an hour, and then another. Finally, I found one that might have looked familiar, or I was so desperate that I imagined that it did. When I stepped up to the door, it opened for me, and I took a seat. It started up, and in spite of being a lifelong agnostic, I prayed my heart out. The train slowed to a stop. The doors opened, and for a second I thought I was saved. People. Human beings. I'd be the most devout man in the world. Then I noticed the eyes. Specifically, a third large eye in the center of their forehead. Well, fuck you then, God, I thought. They were easier to take than the last bunch, though, and I was thankful for that. The third eye blinked independently of the other two, though, and that was nauseating. And when one of them smiled or laughed or spoke with another, I couldn't help but notice that their teeth were sharp and misshapen and yellow-green with filth. But if I was careful and selectively blind, I could pretend for a stretch that I was home. Until one of them entered with a sandwich in hand, and I realized that I was starving and hadn't eaten or drank in what must have been days. The next terminus I came to, I decided to try and find something to eat or drink. I don't know why I waited, but it seemed important to ride to the end of the line. I got there and could barely bring myself to leave. I'd never seen the stranger leave the underground. I'd never seen him eat or drink either. My stomach would not take no for an answer, though. I steeled myself and tried to keep my face carefully neutral. Made my way out onto the station proper. And then I got confused. I was looking for escalators or stairs or something like that. But all I saw was holes in the ground, the walls and the ceiling. Gaping, irregular-sized holes. Like I was in the middle of a beehive. What was I supposed to do? Leap into one? It didn't make any sense to me. Not until someone came through one. He floated up through the floor, and then floated by me. He frowned for a second, or at least I think it was a frown. But apparently whatever kept them from recognizing me as an alien in the subway extended at least this far. It did not, unfortunately, allow me to levitate, which seemed to be the only way out of the subway station beehive thing. Swearing to myself, I made my way back down to the tunnel. I was angry, lost, starving, and I had been abandoned to a fate that, if it wasn't worse than hell, was at least twice as stupid and 3 times as nonsensical. I was not in the best frame of mind, which I feel excuses the mistake. Normally, I take corners with a wide berth because everyone knows that if you just dart around a corner sharply in a public place, chances are decent that you're going to walk right into someone. As I did. I slammed into someone, a woman, and fell to the ground. Without thinking, I reacted like any New Yorker would. Badly.
Jesus, you stupid bitch! Watch where you're going!
I realized my mistake even before she did. Her eyes grew quizzical and confused. And when she really noticed me, they bulged with horror. She leapt, floated quickly, back from me and let out something scream-like, a little more yowly than what I was used to. But I got the point. Further down the tunnel, I saw alien, 3-eyed heads turning towards us. I thought, suddenly, about all those sharp, filthy teeth. And just like that, I was running. Subway train wasn't there, but there is a walkway along the tunnel. For the repairmen, I assume. That's who would use it where I'm from anyways. I took it at full speed and just kept running until breath felt like getting stabbed. I stopped, panting, and looked back. The tunnel had curved, so I couldn't see the light any longer, but nobody appeared to be following me. Going back, though, was not an option. I continued forward in the dark for a long time. Eventually, I came to a small opening in the wall and stopped there for a rest. Hunger, despair, and a full-speed terrified run had left me absolutely drained. I probably would have wept again, which seemed to be all I was capable of lately. But it just seemed like too much work. I sat against the wall, legs splayed out, and imagined I was beating that bastard stranger to death with a hammer. It was a relieving image. A rat was shuffling around nearby in the dark. Every so often, I would kick out a foot to scare it away. But after a while, I didn't even bother with that. Rabies or any other disease it might be carrying would be a blessing compared to endless traveling through the subways of strange worlds, lost, destitute, and alone. When it crept near me, I didn't shoo it off. Even when it reached and pressed against my leg, I couldn't bring myself to care. Not until a train passed by. The lights of its cars lit up the culvert I was in. And the thing that I had thought was a rat. It was rat-like, yes, but not as much as it was spider-like. If someone had bred the two of them together, the resulting abomination might have been almost as horrible as the thing nuzzling my leg. I shrieked, flung myself up from the floor, and booted it like a soccer player would, right into the opposite wall. Its back made a sickening crunch, and I watched it twitch out its last before the final car passed and the darkness returned. And in the darkness, a terrible thought came to me. I wondered if it was edible. I didn't want to, and I gagged just imagining it. But I was hungry, and there was no guarantee that I'd be able to find food in this place, or ever again. Rat spider was my only option. I held off as long as I could, but in the end, survival trumped squeamishness. I had my lighter, but nothing to light on fire. I picked meat off of its carcass and cooked it a little by holding it over the flame. But it didn't help much. Nothing could have. Its meat was foul, more foul than anything you can imagine. I've been that desperate for food since, and eaten many other questionable things. But nothing has ever been as bad as that rat spider. In retrospect, that is when I became a stranger. Before, I'd struggled to reach that expressionless state the other had maintained. What I'd taken for calm was numbness. A sharp rock thrown in a river will, over time, have its edges rounded off by the water beating over it. And what I'd gone through had done the same. Tearing up and eating a monster in the dark, below an alien world. The last of my edges smoothed. By the time I left the darkness and came back into the tunnel, I was expressionless and empty, as much as the one who led me here had ever been. That wasn't the worst of it, though. The worst came later, the first time I got stuck. The stranger had mentioned it, but in the state I'd been in, I hardly noticed. One night, at the end of the line, I was asked to leave the train. The world was one of the closer to normal ones. The people were almost human, as I recognized it. They were orange, sure, and hunchback, but other than that, they were practically normal. After the last world, where the people had been hideously overweight, six-breasted hermaphrodites with no noses, the orange guys were pretty good looking to me. I thought at first that the conductor was talking to someone else, but I was the only one in the car. And moreover, I understood him. The oranges certainly hadn't been speaking English all day, but nonetheless, I could understand what he was saying. When I stood, I began to realize why. I couldn't stand up straight. I was hunchbacked, and as I saw in my reflection against the window as I exited, orange. I pieced together the rest from there. Stuck meant that I was trapped in this world, for some reason, and stuck looking like them as well. Which would be handy if I wanted to take the opportunity to leave the subway station, which is possible most times, but requires a lot of care and is quite overwhelming. Alien worlds are a little revolting, I've found. You try to compare them to your own, but the differences are so vast that it just makes you sick. I left that subway anyways, because it was clear I wasn't returning to the central hub, what I'd taken to calling the infinite line of subway trains that night. Or any other night, I soon found out. Whatever had let me go unnoticed wasn't working any longer. I considered, briefly, staying. But this place wasn't home, and could never be. Even if they look like me, their culture was bound to be different. That was a lesson I'd learned before. Even worlds where the people are absolutely indistinguishable from me are fraught with danger. I was once on a world where the people looked just like me. Well, actually, they looked Brazilian. But that was more than close enough. But then I learned the hard way that the gesture that to me means hello meant something gravely insulting. Insulting enough that I'd been beaten half to death while a crowd looked on with approval. Besides, even if that place had a culture I could fake, I didn't want to stay. I wanted one of two things: to find my way home, or to find the stranger who'd set me on this path and beat the shit out of him. Nothing else would do. So I wanted to move on. I wasn't sure, though, if I could do to some poor sucker what had been done to me. Could I really force someone else to wander the eternal underground like me? It turned out I didn't have to. After a few months, one of them did notice me. Yes, and began to follow me for weeks. I very carefully made it seem like I hadn't seen him, just like the stranger had. But I was torn between the desire to warn him away and the desire to bring him to the end of the line so I could leave this dismal world already. The last night, he followed me to the end of the line, just as I had once done. He hadn't managed to work up the nerve to sit right across from me, though, and as soon as the train stopped at the terminus, he rushed off. I waited, hoping the conductor wouldn't see me and I could move on. But to no avail. I left the car, and the metro rushed off without me, and I cursed inside. As I walked around the corner towards the ticket booths, the young man who had been following me attacked. He had a wicked, curved knife and should have caught me by surprise. But I'd been traveling through hostile alien worlds for several years. My reflexes were sharp. We struggled viciously before I managed to wrestle the knife from him. I don't know how it got in his neck. I don't think I wanted to kill him. I hadn't even been that angry. Remembering my own building rage from so long before. Afterwards, as he lay there, bleeding out, I got pissed. I kicked him repeatedly, shouting at him. He was supposed to follow me, I told him, as I kicked his ribs, feeling them break. I fled the scene of the crime, but not for long. I was there, bright and early the next day, to catch the first subway of the morning. And that night, when I rode it to the end of the line, I was invisible to the conductor again. I guess you can either kill them or bring them with you if you want to return to the central hub. I was invisible again, but I was also orange and hunchback still. I stayed that way until the next time I became stuck, the next time I killed. That one went much faster. I didn't wait for her to follow me. Once I was recognized as a stranger, I recognized her as the next one. And I made my choice. I won't bring anyone else into this. It makes me wonder, though, about the stranger who inducted me. I wonder what he originally looked like, and whether he knew he could have killed me. I wonder, too, about the others I saw back home, and the rare few I come across since I left. Do they kill them or take them? And whichever one they choose, do they consider it a mercy? I can't bring myself to talk to them, to ask. We're damned either way, and the damned should suffer in solitude. I've killed 15 of them now, and I've gotten very good at it. But I've made a decision. I'm done killing. Innocents, at least. Before I returned to the central hub, I filled a backpack with as much paper as I could cram into it, and I wrote this story over and over again, to be left in as many subway trains as I can, a couple thousand messages in bottles, cast into a sea of steel rails. This is a request and a warning. My request above was that you find my mother and tell her a lie. It's a white lie, don't worry. Tell my mother that I love her and that I am trying to come home. It may give her some hope or a small measure of peace. I wish it were true, too. But here's the thing. I've been thinking of myself like Odysseus, lost and adrift, looking to return to familiar shores. But I am not lost at sea. I am lost in endless tunnels. The labyrinth. The difference is important, because labyrinths are designed, built. Somebody or something made this impossible place, and they must be held accountable for what they've done to me. They cast me as Theseus, not Odysseus. But I won't play that part any longer, either. The strange rules of this place have turned me from the human I began as into something else, then something else again. They have made me into a monster, and so I will be the minotaur of this labyrinth. And if I can, I will tear it down around me and destroy those that built it. About 8 years ago, I was intrigued by a strange man who took me to the end of the line on a subway train. At the time, I thought he had dragged me to hell, and for a while it was. But this isn't hell. This central hub of diverging paths, it's something else. I once viewed this place as a labyrinth, and it still is. But now, I believe it to be some bridging anomaly, one that exists between realities, like roots spanning endlessly through the ground. However, there's much more to it. I discovered that if spending enough time in the hub, you go back to your original form if you had been stuck previously, if given a few weeks. There's a sort of aura that surrounds you when you're in a foreign reality. It hides your form and makes you look like the people of that dimension. When you get stuck, your body physically changes to match the strangeness of the world you're in. If you're able to get unstuck, you slowly revert. Ever since then, I've tried to stay in the hub as much as I can, only venturing into other worlds for supplies. I know I said I wouldn't kill innocents anymore, and I haven't. I've only killed those that deserve it. Strangers that duped people like me, and the scum of whatever universe I occasionally get stuck in. Consider it an interdimensional service. I traveled to places that shook me more than the bizarre alien worlds. I remember one tunnel was broken, shattered in places, chipped and cracked. When I entered it, the tunnel was collapsed in places. At first I thought it was just an abandoned system. Plenty of those in my reality. But after clambering through the rubble and debris, I found a broken world, one of seared earth and ripping winds. I realized I could read some of the words on various road signs. They were faded and half worn away, but the letters were definitely English. If I had to guess, what I would consider World War III had come and gone at some point. I didn't stay long. I had a thought that filled me with dread before I chose to ignore it. What if these tunnels aren't just different universes? What if they're also different timelines or points in time? What if that world I was in was mine, but a divergent path? Maybe it was the timeline where the Cold War turned hot, or maybe it was the future of my original dimension. Or what if it was my reality, but after 8 years, war had ruined it, and I would never know. Again, I dismissed this for my own motivation to get back to my world. Many train tunnels led to worlds that were something else entirely. Utopias. Some were technological masterpieces, others felt like they were magic fantasies. But I knew I couldn't stay. I would destroy their tranquility. Of course, some utopias were facades. Peace was maintained through egregious means. Around year 4 or 5, I began to indulge myself. I found realities that were similar to mine and began to live out some of my less than legal fantasies. Mind you, I refrained from physically hurting the innocent. I was an arsonist to abandoned buildings. I stole from big box stores. I picked fights with bullies. I shot and stabbed thugs. I won't defend my actions. They were wholly for catharsis. After I was done running amok, I slipped into the subway, disappeared from reality. After dimension hopping for a while, I spent around 2 years straight in the central hub, trying to figure it out. I learned slowly that this place is stranger than I thought. I've become tuned in to whatever this space between realities is. I began to recognize that some dimensions were easier to get stuck in than others. Those that operated similar to my original universe were easier for me to get lost in, for my mind to adjust to quicker. Despite some of them containing strange abominations of life, they had similar physics, similar societal workings, and languages that were easier to understand from the beginning. I figured this out after getting stuck in one of my indulgent realities. I'd just gotten done raiding a store for some food. Food that reminded me of home, not the rat spider I had to force down my throat, much to my continued dismay. I boarded a subway and went to the end of the line. I shoveled some of the candy bars into my mouth, relishing in their sweetness, letting myself have that moment. When I got to the end, I was told to leave the train. I'd let myself get too comfortable with that place. I was stuck once again. I found some vagrant holding a lady at gunpoint. I waltzed up behind him and slit his throat with a knife I acquired some time before, then walked away. Must have been confusing as hell for the lady, but considering she wasn't the one bleeding out in the alleyway, she'll get over it. The next train I was able to escape on. Worlds that were more removed from my own gave me a sense of mild disorientation even before I would enter them. I realized this sense could be used to my advantage. I began to use it to disqualify realities long before risking becoming stuck. But I also began thinking of a plan B. I began to leave marks on the walls near dimensions that were the most similar to my Earth, in case I ever decided to give up my search and settle for one of them. My time in the hub has allowed me to sense other strangers nearby. I can also feel if they've pulled others into this place. Those are the ones I kill. The ones who have subjected unwitting lives to this hell. It's a guilt that they carry, one that almost comes off as a repugnant odor. The sends ripples through me. I haven't encountered the stranger that pulled me into this place again. Not since he left. A part of me is relieved I haven't. What I want to do to him. What I would do to him. It's a dark place. One that I'm scared to go to. I know I wouldn't be able to control myself if I ever saw him again. For some time, I considered suicide. Despite my previous determination, the human spirit can only stretch so far. My search for those responsible for this hell has turned up nothing. And a few years ago, this threw me down into a deep hole. But then something came to me. What better thing to keep me going than to indulge in the most basic human instinct? To understand the unknown. So that's what I did for years. This instinct was rewarded with the senses I've come to obtain. Along with this, I began to question this hub once again. Why it's here. Is it some game for a bored god to watch us mortals struggle to understand and survive this place? Or is it a construct that has always existed, merely took the form of this train station for some of us? Maybe it's a different structure for strangers who have nothing like subway systems where they're from. To wrap this up, if you're reading this, I'm still alive, and I'm still fighting. And for my mom, not a day goes by I don't want to get back to you. I don't know if I'll ever find our world, but I can't stop. Not until I'm dead. That is the human condition. Senseless hope in the face of insurmountable opposition. Andrew rose from the ground after writing the last word on the paper, stapling the pages together, and carefully placing it in his duffel bag, one he had acquired in a previous reality. He realized he was running low on supplies, forcing him to begin another reality hop. He passed by tunnel after tunnel, gauging the feel of each one. Coming up to one that didn't make him feel out of place, he grabbed a nearby railing and hoisted his right foot onto the high ledge. However, his footing slipped, throwing him backwards. His right hand, unprepared for the sudden change, lost its grip on the metal railing. Landing on the ground, his head barely missing the tracks behind him. An injury he had sustained more than once. He looked behind himself, seeing the steel lines just beyond his head, and sighed relief at his position. Picking himself off the ground and examining the platform he had just fallen from, there was a small puddle where he had placed his foot, explaining why he had slipped. But as he placed his hand on the railing to brace himself again, he became aware of something on it. There was an indent on the metal tubing where his hand was previously. He felt the indents. His hand conformed to the shape of it. It nearly perfectly matched the shape of his hand. Andrew played through the fall in his head. It was then he remembered feeling something in his empty right hand in the split second he was falling. It felt like he was still holding on to the railing as he fell. He had reached out for it, but despite not catching it, the sensation in his hand told otherwise. The rules of this place were revealing themselves again. He placed himself near a wall opposite the railing. He was only a few inches from the surface, as to mitigate injury from the impact. He reached his hand out to the railing, it remaining at least 3 feet from his hand. He tilted backwards, letting his body fall against the wall. As his balance was lost, he reached out to the railing, motioning like he was grabbing it, but to no effect. Andrew repeated this action dozens of times, but he couldn't seem to replicate it, even falling onto the platform rather than the wall. Doubt entered his mind, asking himself if the indent in the railing was there previously, but he hadn't noticed it. He looked at the ground level under the platform. The fall was much longer and hurt more. Is that the trick? He thought. the fear of injury. Deciding a bit of pain to indulge his curiosity was no real consequence. He stepped up to the ledge, placing himself too far from the railing for it to save him at the last moment. With a few breaths, Andrew leaned forward, letting his center of gravity go too far, and his fall assured. He fell. However, his instant reaction was to brace his fall, landing onto his hands and feet. No real pain, and no results. Annoyed at himself, he climbed back onto the platform, placed himself at the edge once again, but turned around. Looking at the railing, he kept his eyes focused on the metal beams as he let himself fall over. As he felt his balance give out, his heart rate shot up. He couldn't see how soon the ground was coming. Using this adrenaline, he reached out for the railing. In his mind, he wanted nothing more than to grab it. He flexed his hand in a gripping motion, and with a sudden jolt, his fall had stopped. Andrew could feel a solid object in his hand, yet nothing occupied it. He looked to his feet, which were pressed against the edge of the platform. He turned his head around to see that he was, in fact, suspended in the air. This strange realization caused him to lose focus, letting his grip give out, resulting in a painful thud on the ground. His back hurt, but his mind was flooded with a newfound goal. Now that he knew he could do this, it was no longer about psyching himself up to do it. It was now about performing it with a calm mind. The next few hours, Andrew attempted his newfound telekinesis with varying success. Every few dozen failed attempts, he would grip something out of his reach for a few seconds, prompting him to try again. Each successful attempt, he would learn more about the feeling of the power and the state of mind he was in when it happened. As his understanding grew, so did his consistency. Eventually, he was able to always find a grip on a railing or nearby track, albeit a weak grip, but one he could maintain concentration on while studying the ability. Days had passed, but his new power kept him occupied. That is, until his stomach could no longer be ignored. With a loud gurgle, Andrew finally listened to his painful hunger. As he turned to find his duffel bag, just then, another hub dweller snatched it from its spot some feet away from him and bolted off. As Andrew attempted to give chase, his legs became weak. The sheer focus of the last few days had taken their toll. Andrew reached out, absolute concentration on grabbing the person now some distance away from him. As he fell through the empty air between them, he could sense the entire area around the thief. He didn't care how specific he was, only that he grabbed it. Andrew flexed his hand. As he did, his vision shifted. It appeared that the entire tunnel in front of him was suddenly growing closer, like the dolly zoom of a camera. The thief grew closer to him, despite their increasing distance. He grabbed their shirt. Suddenly, he was right next to them. The hub rebounded back to its original state in Andrew's eyes. A great tremble shook through the walls of the tunnel around them, as well as a massive rush of air, strong enough to nearly push them over. The bag thief looked at Andrew, wide-eyed, shocked, and terrified of what had just happened. One moment they were 100 feet away. The next moment, their victim was latched onto them, with the whole tunnel seeming like it was going to cave in. They looked at Andrew, waiting for him to pummel them into the tracks. But he did no such thing. "I just want my stuff back," he said, calmly. The thief slowly releasing the duffel bag from their hold. After reclaiming his things, the other stranger began to flee. Andrew whistled to them, tossing them a few supplies from his bag. They caught it, somewhat taken by his generosity. Without another word, Andrew proceeded back the way he had came. It was a few more days before Andrew's supplies began to wane. He had been absolutely focused on his newfound abilities. After stealing more food and other survival items, Andrew discovered that his telekinesis and shifting didn't work in the alternate universes, or at the very least, the ones that he visited. Weeks were now passing. Andrew was reality hopping faster than before, being able to shift through the tunnels and a far more sensitive dimension reading. He could refine his searching. Andrew was able to nearly thrive in the central hub, being able to find universes with higher compatibility to his original. Food, water, and other amenities were now in abundance. I remembered to get a notebook and pen from my last hop. Decided to start writing again. My mind has been buzzing with ideas and theories ever since I developed these extra powers. I've been going through this hub at Mach speeds, or at least it feels that way. Something keeps coming up in my mind. Someone has to be taking notice to these powers. Maybe at one point they were. Maybe whoever built this place, if anyone built it, waited for someone to figure out these abilities. Maybe the architects could do the same things and wanted to share the power. Maybe they wanted to make us fight each other. Maybe this is just one big arena. Or maybe it's something else. Something I feel is far more likely. If other dimensions change us to suit them, could this hub system be doing the same thing, altering those of us who stay in it long enough, to who or whatever originally used this place? But that's what makes me wonder how I've gone unnoticed by a higher power, if one is watching. Did they forget this place existed? Did they get bored of waiting for someone to figure this place out, then forget to dismantle it? Are the poor bastards like me just the lab rats of some forgotten maze? Part of me takes solace in the idea that this place is just a random phenomena, or a structure that has always existed. But the other part of me has a deep dread that there might exist at least one being capable of creating such a place. But it might as well be as important as last week's toy to a 6-year-old. But I've had another idea in mind. If there is a god or architect or designer, I'm gonna make them take notice. I'm gonna tear this place down myself. If I can crash it, I might be trapping countless other strangers in dimensions they don't belong in. But if they've been in here as long as I have, I know they'd rather be forced to adapt to a new world than to wander the endless tunnels. And to the man who brought me into this game to begin with, All I have to say is, go to hell. Andrew began reaching out, his ethereal hands sinking into the tunnel around him. He gripped the matter within the walls and pulled. He could hear the tiles cracking as the material behind them bulged outwards. With a struggle, Andrew was able to rip the concrete out of the walls, leaving massive craters. He began tearing down the tunnel as he walked through it, sealing it off with rubble. Suddenly, he realized what he had just done. He had just made the hub finite, at least as far as he could regularly traverse. A path was now limited. Infinity just got smaller. That was his green light. Andrew set down on one path, only diverting when he hit a pre-made dead end. He tugged at the walls, ground, and ceiling as he walked, peeling them back, shattering the structure around him, clogging the path behind him. Either he would gain the attention of the creator, or he would die trying. Pausing, looking at his handiwork, then back in front of him, seeing the current tunnel extending far beyond. He then got an idea that made him wear a devious smirk. Once again, he grabbed onto the tunnel around him, then concentrated down the path ahead, as far as his eyes could see. Andrew then initiated one of his jumps, his focal point zooming in closer to him. He felt his metaphysical arms being stretched. The pull was so great, he could feel the pull physically. For a moment, he considered that he might actually tear his arms off doing this. To hell with it, he thought. Taking a deep breath, Andrew put one foot forward. With the familiar ear-numbing rumble, he felt a rush of air pass by him, and a sudden jolt of momentum, typical of completing the jump. Staggering forward, he quickly turned around to see a fury of debris and dust rush towards him. He put his hands out, creating a telekinetic barrier to stop the flood of rubble from crushing him. Barely managing, Andrew held the torrent of concrete and steel tracks at bay. There is now a massive plug of destroyed tunnel, unable to be passed by anyone. If this wouldn't attract attention, nothing would. He faced the long tunnel, seeing another dead end. Grabbing the area around himself, initiating a jump, and thrusting himself into it. Without looking back, he bolted down the open tunnel to his left, getting out of the way of the incoming debris storm. It slammed into the wall, damaging it and the surrounding structure. This is how it went on. A dozen jumps became hundreds. Hours quickly turned into days. Andrew's havoc, he estimated, spanned several thousand miles. He was making jumps in continuous motion, not paying a second thought to his actions. His power was growing exponentially. With it, his destructive capabilities. Each jump, he could bring hundreds of tons with him. Andrew was in the process of expanding his ethereal reach, inflating the invisible sphere far into the matter of the structure. It was at least 800 feet from him in all directions, when he felt a strange sensation, barely reaching through his orb of influence. It was a feeling he had not felt in some time. His sixth sense was telling him there was an outlet near him, one that was undeniably similar to his reality. He released his hold over the tunnel and began to search for this outlet. After a few turns, he came to an exit, not unlike many he had seen before. This one had no mark to tell him if he had been to it previously. He outstretched his sense, letting himself feel how familiar it was. The further in he reached, the more an underlying emotion came to the surface. It was a tugging sensation, the kind one feels when returning home after a very long time. Skeptical that it was another similar dimension playing tricks on him, it wouldn't be the first time, he thought. He was too cautious to let himself think he had finally gotten back. However, this finally brought an old and terrifying idea back to him. His plan B. Was he finally ready to end his searching, to end his destruction? His heart raced just from the idea of living in a real world again. Could he adjust to it? Could he assimilate back into a society? Had he spent too much time removed in such a strange and alien place to go back to normalcy? He put his duffel bag down and sat in front of the outlet. He hadn't stopped his path of destruction for days. Moreover, he hadn't stopped traveling for years. To sit down and ask himself if it was finally time to leave. The prospect of it alone weighed on his breathing. A million thoughts jumping in and out of focus. Memories he had not thought about in years came flooding back in. His old place of work, his friends, his hobbies, his mom. That was it. Andrew stood back up. He had made up his mind. Either this wasn't his reality, and he wouldn't have the constant pain of trying to get back, or it was his world, and he would finally see his mother again. As he took those heavy steps into the outlet, he turned around, reaching out to the walls. With a massive pull, he brought the structure down, sealing off this exit from the hub, cementing his commitment to this world, whether it was his or not. He turned back around, looking down the dark and curving subway tunnel. Andrew took a deep breath and continued. The tunnels went on for some time, giving him too much opportunity to second-guess his choice. However, he began to see light reflecting off the walls. The source was obscured by the bend, but what he could see was piping and electronic boxes. Once close enough, he looked at them. They had warning labels in English. That was a good sign to him. The source of light was, as he assumed, a subway platform. He could see figures moving to and fro on it, but couldn't quite make out their exact features. He began to panic slightly, thinking he had just marooned himself in an alien dimension. However, they were unmistakably human. Relief took over anxiety, but he felt odd walking among people like him again. He felt like he should be looked at strangely, like his time in the hub was a mark of shame. But as he had known all his life in New York, no one paid him much attention. Either this was a near exact copy of his reality, or it was the real thing. He worked up the courage to look for another piece of the puzzle. Going up to a payphone and looking at the address book, finding the phone numbers. He searched the last names, starting with E. His heart was racing while looking through the names. He kept thinking he found his mom, or that maybe he had passed her name. Finally, his index finger stopped. Eric's, Terry. His heart nearly stopped. Just seeing the name, he was about in tears. Her address was the same, even after all this time. Andrew contemplated calling her, but quickly remembered he didn't have any money from this reality, not for some time. He sat on a nearby bench, wondering what to do. If he should just show up or ask a stranger for a few coins. Maybe he should go to the police. No doubt they've listed him as dead by now. Before he could decide, a train came into the station. He looked up at the location he was in. It was an hour from his mom's address by train. The subway doors opened. He decided he had to see her, no matter what. He needed to know. Andrew got in one of the cars and took his seat. His time as a stranger kicked in. He became still and numb to the world. However, he soon grew fearful that someone, like him from years ago, might notice his statue-like behavior, try to follow him to the end of the line. Instead, he leaned his head against a nearby metal hand pole, tried to look like a natural rider. The car shifted and began to move, wondering to himself, as he had been doing for years, did he actually stumble upon this reality by accident? Or did he finally get the attention of whoever might have made the hub? Did they bring his reality back to him so that he would stop destroying their creation? Another thought came to him. Was this reality just a near-perfect copy? Was this reality's Terry Eric's his mom? Or was it some other Andrew's mom? Maybe it didn't matter. The train exited the tunnel, finally coming out into the open city. The sun was hanging in the late afternoon sky. He let his thoughts rest, indulging in the moment. He closed his eyes and pretended to sleep, listening to the sound of the train rolling over those all too familiar steel tracks.